This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This time we're doing a worst list with a look at the worst X spells in Magic. An X spell refers to any spell that has X as part of its cost. There are a lot of powerful X spells in Magic. The fact that they can scale based on how much mana you pump into them is pretty great. And although it's in need of an update, I have talked about the best X spells in a past MTG Top 10. However, some X spells are still pretty awful. It doesn't matter if the spell can scale all game long, if the effect it has is bad or meaningless, and that's most of what we're going to see here. To end up on a list like this, a card cannot have ever top-8'd a significant Magic event, nor can it be widely played in EDH. The cards on the list are also all awful in their respective limited formats. Alright, without further ado, let's take a look at the 10 worst X spells in Magic. At number 10, I've got Balduvian Hydra. It's the only creature on the list. Actually, adding something to the board makes it hard for a creature to show up here, but even if it does add to the board, Balduvian Hydra is still pretty awful. Lots of Hydras are X spells, but most of them are pretty great. Not this one. It enters with X +1/+0 counters on it, and you can remove a +1/+0 counter to prevent 1 damage dealt to the Hydra. And yes, those are +1/+0 counters. This was before they realized standardizing everything to a +1/+1 counter was a good idea, so there were all kinds of weird counters out there. Anyway, you can also add one of these weird +1/+0 counters to the Hydra during your upkeep if you pay 3 red mana. So, what you have here is a creature that can enter with pretty high power if you have a bunch of mana, but there isn't a whole lot it can do with it. If anything blocks it, or if it blocks anything, you have to remove counters to keep the Hydra around, and you have to do it for every single damage dealt to the Hydra since it only has 1 toughness. This means it will quickly shrink, and ultimately die without having any significant impact on the game. Sure, adding counters is cool, but having the mana around to do that is a big ask. It doesn't matter how much mana you pump into X or how many counters you add to this card is going to be really unimpressive. It is worth noting that for a while this card was less bad. For about 10 years between 6th edition and Magic 2010, damage used the stack, so you could put the damage from the Hydra on the stack before starting to remove counters to keep it around, which meant it could more effectively kill things in combat. Even then, it isn't like it was played anywhere, but under those rules, the Hydra wouldn't be bad enough to make this list, but obviously those rules don't apply anymore, so it definitely deserves to be here. At number 9, I have Vitalizing Cascade. I hate cards that don't do anything but gain you life, and you should too. Using up a card for an effect like this is almost never worth it, even on an X spell. I don't care how much life you gain with this, it really isn't going to do enough to win you the game, short of you creating infinite mana. Instead, it just delays the inevitable. Life gain decks are a big deal in EDH, since once you add payoffs to life gain, the effect gets a lot stronger, but even in that type of deck, no one is particularly interested in the Cascade when you can just run creatures and other meaningful spells that can gain you life, in addition to doing other stuff. At number 8, it is Flaming Gambit. There is a long legacy of good red X spells in the game, starting back in Alpha with Fireball. Flaming Gambit is not part of that legacy. It lets you do X damage to a player, but that player can choose to redirect the damage to one of their creatures instead of taking the damage themselves. So, this means that the Gambit basically has to do more damage than the highest toughness among creatures your opponent controls, or it does nothing. And even when it does something, the fact you give your opponent this choice means they can very frequently find situations where this card's effect just doesn't matter. For example, they can turn it into a bad edict effect that makes them sacrifice a meaningless creature, or they can just take the damage when they have so much life that it doesn't matter. Now, this does have a couple of cool things going for it. I guess it's an instant, unlike most red X spells, and it has flashback, but none of that overcomes a serious problem this card has. It doesn't matter when you cast it doesn't matter how many times you cast it just doesn't do something meaningful 99% of the time. At number 7, it is Soul Strings. This X spell has one of the big mechanics from Prophecy, and it's one that is pretty much just downside. There are lots of cards from that set that allow your opponent to pay some mana to completely blank your card, and that's what we have here. Soul String lets you return 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, but you don't get to do anything if your opponent pays X. This means you have to pay at least 1 generic and a black, and you have to hope no one has 1 mana available, and the payoff? Well, you just get a run-of-the-mill black sorcery that lets you return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. That kind of effect isn't exactly blowing anyone out of the water, but if you are interested in it, there are dozens of better cards that do the same thing without the risk of just being blanked by your opponent. At number 6, it is Excise, another one of those bad prophecy cards. This one is a removal spell that lets you exile an attacking creature, unless of course your opponent can pay X, in which case nothing happens and you go down a card. Removal that can only deal with attacking creatures is already limited enough, but this can just be blanked entirely, and the fact it can only deal with attackers really combos poorly with that effect, as your opponent is very likely to have the mana available to blank this during combat. With both of these X spells, you might get a little bit of tempo, but going down an entire card and not impacting the board at all makes them not worth it in the least. And yeah, if you want white removal, there's no reason that this would be where you turn. At number 5, it is Sealed Fate, which is, surprise, surprise, another card that doesn't really do anything. It lets you look at the top X cards of your opponent's library and you get to exile one of them and put the rest back in any order. In general, I'm not a huge fan of effects that exile your opponent's stuff from their library without impacting the board, but I know they are a necessary evil as a sideboard tech against combo decks, but Sealed Fate is a way worse version of that kind of card because you have to pay a ton of mana to really look at a significant number of your opponent's cards, and it's a sorcery, so you'll find yourself tapping out to do this without anything added to the board. You get to get rid of 1 card from among the ones you look at and then put the others back in any order. I do think this effect is kind of cool. It's fun to imagine putting all of your opponent's lands on the top or bottom of the pile, but you have to spend so much mana to actually do something with this, and frequently your opponent will have what they need in their hand or on the board to win the game anyway, especially because you just used up a card and a ton of mana for nothing. And sure, if you get infinite mana, planning out your opponent's whole game is kind of hilarious, but you know what? You should just win the game if you have that much mana around, especially because this can easily be broken up by them cracking a fetch land or something like that. The only fate that is sealed when you cast this is your own, because you're going to lose. At number 4, I have Malicious Advice. So, tapping stuff down can be pretty nice in some situations, and Malicious Advice is capable of tapping down 3 pretty important permanent types and at instant speed. The problem is, it is very inefficient at doing it. At 3 mana, it's tapping down a single thing, and that's rarely going to be worth doing. What's more is, in addition to being inefficient for mana, Malicious Advice also makes you pay life equal to X. If it didn't make you pay life, Malicious Advice would still not be very good, but it wouldn't be one of the worst X spells ever. I know some people tend to look at a card like this and think of the ideal situation, like with this one, using it to tap down all of your opponent's stuff at the end of their turn sounds pretty sweet, but the cost in mana and life drastically reduces your chances of ever actually being able to do it. And there are going to be more times where that effect is meaningless anyway than there are going to be times where it is useful. When evaluating a card, you do have to think about what it will do on a regular basis, and Malicious Advice normally won't be doing something that makes it worth paying mana, life, and a card. Frequently, it'll be stuck in your hand because it just isn't worth using. If someone told you to play this in your deck, well, they gave you some malicious advice. At number 3, it is Part Water. This sorcery gives X target creatures Island Walk until end of turn. Unlike the other cards we've seen, it costs X twice, which means you have to pump even more mana into it for it to do something, and the something that it does is very underwhelming. Obviously, if your opponent has an island around, this can do some work, but you already need to have a meaningful board state, and your opponent has to have the right type of basic land in play, or it doesn't do anything. 3 mana to give 1 creature Island Walk until end of turn won't be worth it most of the time anyway, so you're really going to need to sink a lot of mana into this, even in an ideal situation, before it ever has a meaningful effect. At number 2, it is Venerian Glimmer. This card has a fairly unique effect for a blue card, because it lets you make your opponent discard a card. This card's from Planar Chaos, a set where they did all kinds of wacky things with the color pie. Unfortunately, having a neat effect for a blue card doesn't make it good, because this is an absolutely terrible discard spell. When you cast this, your opponent shows you their hand, and you get to make them discard a non-land with a mana value of X or less. If you're paying a small amount of mana for this, there's a good chance you won't hit anything, and if you pay a large amount of mana for this, you're no longer doing something that's worth it. If you're paying 5 for this to make sure it hits something, well, you would have much rather spent the mana casting a creature that actually adds to the board. Even like a 5 mana 5/5 is better at that point. So yeah, whatever mode you choose with this card, spending very little mana, spending a lot of mana, you lose. And at number 1, it is Avalanche. This X spell lets you blow up a bunch of snow lands, but it does it very inefficiently. You have to pay 5 mana to hit your first snow-covered land, and while it does get a little more reasonable the higher up you go with X, there are far better ways to nuke a bunch of lands than this. And most of them aren't limited to only destroying snow lands. And sure, there are decks that are reliant on snow lands and this can mess them up in theory, but what really gets me here is that it hates on a very narrow strategy and it doesn't even do it close to efficiently. Something as simple as Orcish Settlers makes Avalanche look like a joke. Even in a world where everyone played Snowlands, I don't think this would be good, as turning it into a one-sided Armageddon would still be too expensive, and paying 6 to blow up a couple of lands isn't especially good either. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst X spells in Magic. Do you agree or disagree with the list? Let me know in the comments. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on over 540 other MTG Top 10s, including many more worst lists, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. If you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron, by becoming a channel member, or by buying Nitsa Hone merch. You can find ways to do all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.